It's nice to have everyone here for a brief. Number one, we're going to have a little bit of a brief review of some of the halachas of Tisha B'Av. And following that, we'll have our discussion, our shiur, that we gave it a title of How Do We Rebuild? How do we rebuild? And obviously we are talking about the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, and it's a question that is asked, and as a result, I think it's a fair discussion to address it. But before we do that, there are two things I would like to do. Number one, I would like to thank our sponsors for today's shiur. So today's shiur, I'm just gonna adjust my camera here for a second. Today's shiur is sponsored by the Fishlinsky children. It's to commemorate the second yahrzeit of their mother, Manya Fishlinsky, Miriam Bas Yosef Avram Veshenda, Zechrona Livracha. So the neshama should have an aliyah. And I used to visit Manya. I used to visit Kalman as well, but after his passing, I would visit Manya. Always nice to see her and only good memories. And may our words of Torah that we study here tonight be a schus for her neshama. So we said we're going to start off with a brief review, a few of the halachas that relate to Tisha B'Av. And a few things do change due to the fact that it is a Saturday night, Sunday, Tisha B'Av. So these are reminders. I think we do remember them, that what shuls do is that they have an early mincha, meaning you're not going to have your Shabbos afternoon mincha right before sunset, because you want to give everyone the opportunity to go home and eat a meal. So therefore, shuls in general have an early mincha. We're going to do it here at 6 p.m. And then you go home and you have a shalashudis. And it's a shalashudis using Talmudic language. You could have a spread that would be comparable to King Solomon's table, not the restaurant, but the table of the king himself. So no limitations. There are no limitations to your shalashudis. The only limitation that does exist is time. In other words, we are to finish our meal before sunset, shkia, 8:55 p.m. And it's important to remember that those traditional foods that we eat on Erev Tisha B'Av, like the ashes and the eggs, those are things that we don't eat this year. It's Shabbos, and we are not supposed to show and indicate any of the mourning that the following day will express. Now, Havdalah, it's important to remember, there is no Havdalah over a cup on Motzei Shabbos. We delay it to Sunday night. So this weekend, we will not be making a bracha on the psamim. It cannot be made on Motzei Shabbos, because to go ahead and bring back a spirit on the day that our spirit was taken from us, in essence, would not be appropriate. So there is no besamim on Motzei Shabbos. And Sunday night, it was never established to be only on Motzei Shabbos. When it comes to a fire, the tradition is that those who are in a shul, in a synagogue, make a borei ma'orei ha'esh. That is the tradition, that before the reading of Eicha, if you're at home, you could actually do it as well. The Havdalah over a cup of wine or grape juice or beer or any beverage is delayed until Sunday night. Before we break our fast on Sunday night after Tisha B'Av, we make Havdalah. That is what we do. The only Havdalah that we will have on Motzei Shabbos is in the Shmonesrei, the Atochon Antonu, the blessing that serves as a Havdalah, and it becomes a little bit more important this Motzei Shabbos, because that's the only Havdalah that we do have. When it comes to the prohibitions of Tisha B'Av, we are familiar with the fact that we don't wash ourselves even with cold water, and therefore when it comes to the morning and we do the Negelvas with the Netilas Yadayim, it's only till the knuckles, that's what we do. And so too, our shoes are not leather shoes on Tisha B'Av. And those things that we do read, those things that we do involve our mind, have to relate to the day. We are not to distract ourselves from what the day is about. And therefore, we read things that relate to the destruction, that relate to Tisha B'Av, that relate to our history. And even the learning of Torah, which throughout the year is always encouraged and is viewed as the most ideal of all activities, must be adjusted on Tisha B'Av, that we only learn on Tisha B'Av those things that relate to the day, like the halachos of Tisha B'Av. Obviously, there's a lot of books and there are commentators on the kinos that we could turn to that give us an understanding and an appreciation of the significance of the day. Now, on Tisha B'Av, we fast. At the same time, we know that a chola, a real chola, does not fast on Tisha B'Av. It is not Yom Kippur, where on Yom Kippur, the only person who doesn't fast is in a situation where there's an assessment that perhaps it could be life-threatening. Tisha B'Av is different, that any chola, significant chola, is a person that does not fast. And therefore, it's important to remember that many people who do take medications need to take those medications. There are those that could be delayed. There are those that could not. You speak to your doctor. Any medication that could be taken without water is not an issue at all. So let's say, for example, you're on some thyroid medication. And thyroid medication, it appears it's not the end of the world if you delay it one day, but you could take it theoretically without water, so you take it. You take it in the morning if it's not considered achila to just swallow a pill. When water is needed, then already you have to assess if this is something that a doctor would allow to delay or perhaps not. And it would obviously work case by case, and it has to be addressed individually. Now, when it comes to interacting with one another on Tisha B'Av, the halacha tells us that we do not greet one another. We act like mourners. We lost something quite significant. And therefore, you give that Tisha B'Av nod and not a Shalom Aleichem and not a hello. And that nod itself that we are accustomed to of that day says it all about how we view it, the day itself. Now, something switches midday on Tisha B'Av, Chatzos. Now, those things that the Talmud tells us we don't do on Tisha B'Av, like wearing leather shoes, like washing ourselves, those things, there is no change with midday. The only thing that midday does change is those things that we have minhagim, we have customs to avoid up until that point, we allow it by midday. And it symbolizes the idea that there's some level of comfort that Tisha B'Av provides. So let me just address a question here that David, that is being asked here. A chola who eats on Tisha B'Av. Let me, a good question is being asked here. A chola who eats on Tisha B'Av at night should make havdalah with or without besamim? So the answer is, a chola, a person who's going to be eating on Tisha B'Av, needs to make havdalah. It shouldn't be on wine. It shouldn't be on grape juice. It should be on a beverage, like a good coffee. Besamim are not part of it. It's a weekend without besamim. No besamim. So that's a good question, and that is the answer. We're focusing a little bit about what happens midday. What happens midday on Tisha B'Av? And although Tisha B'Av is considered a day of mourning, a very devastating day, there's some level of comfort that we get from the day itself. What kind of comfort do you get from the day itself? So there's a chapter in Tehillim right? Mizmor La'asaf, Elokim Bo Goim Benachlosecha. In other words, it's a psalm that talks about the destruction. And the Talmud asks the question, wait a second, if this is a psalm that's going to address the devastating, the tragic events of Tisha B'Av, why is it introduced with a mizmor? Why is it a song? It should be a kina. It should be a eulogy. It should be a statement of mourning, not a song. And the Talmud answers that, you know what? HaKadosh Baruch Hu placed his wrath on wood and on stone. In other words, yes, Tisha B'Av is the day that our temple, our Beis Hamikdash, was destroyed. But the wrath was placed on a structure, not on the people. We are alive. We are here. A structure can and will be rebuilt. The people, if God forbid there would have been a churban where Klal Yisrael would vanish, that would have been a kina. That would have been something to bemoan. So the comfort of Tisha B'Av is that we are here. We're still here. And if you think about the tragedies that we focus on Tisha B'Av, the tragedies of the Shoah, and there's no question that if it's a day that is designated to be mindful of Jewish history and the suffering that we've gone through throughout the ages, there's no question that Shoah literature, Holocaust stories should be playing a significant role in our Tisha B'Av. But when we read about the Shoah, we have to remember, guess what? We're here. We're here. We're thriving. We're an incredible nation. Look at the success of our nation. These are things that we have to remember, and that's comfort, that's nechama. And the second half of the day of Tisha B'Av, from midday on, we enter into that nechama zone. There's comfort. There's, you know what, we lost something, but you know what? We're here, and we're going to do good. So that little bit of optimism begins by midday. And therefore, in the afternoon prayer, we have the tradition of trying to daven mincha as soon as possible. So for example, here it's going to be at 2 p.m. We say a prayer of Nachem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, give us comfort. It's time for comfort. There were actually communities that had a tradition that they would say the Nachem the night before Mariv, Shacharis, and Mincha. But for Mariv and Shacharis, they would not say Nachem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, give us comfort, but they would say Rachem, the same exact prayer, but they would introduce it with Rachem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, have mercy. Nachem is appropriate in the afternoon, And therefore, we could already sit on chairs. The custom of not sitting on a chair comes to an end by midday. When it comes to forms of work, we try to avoid any work or anything that will distract us. There's some level of leniency after midday. And so too, when it comes to talis tefillin, for us, for men who wear it for our prayer, it's not for Shachris, but it is for Mincha. Some level of comfort. As we are reviewing a few halachas, I like sharing the story that as a teenager, my father would note that on Tisha B'Av, you don't sleep with a pillow. That's what my father would say. And I remember telling him already as a teenager that if you look carefully, when the Ramah tells us that Tisha B'Av is a day that you try to decrease your personal comfort, the Ramah tells us that what you do is you minimize it. For example, if a person usually sleeps with 2 pillows, on Tisha B'Av you sleep with 1 pillow. So I told my father, it doesn't say that you don't sleep with a pillow. It says that if you usually use 2, you go ahead and you have 1. I only use 1. It doesn't say anywhere to go down to 0. So, and that's my practice. And especially pillows, I don't know if they're so much for comfort nowadays or just simply to keep your neck intact. So I sleep with a pillow on Tisha B'Av. If you do sleep with 2, you could fulfill that custom. I'm not telling you that it's a new chumrah that the few days before Tisha B'Av you should get 2 pillows, that you could go down to 1. I don't think so. But nevertheless, you should know these practices. Now, when it comes to what we are mindful of Tisha B'Av, the Churban, the destruction of the temple, the Talmud notes that the structure itself caught fire only towards the evening of the 9th of Av. This is proven from historians as well. And the majority of the structure was burning on the 10th of Av. And therefore, for us Ashkenazim, we have the tradition of extending the mourning into the 10th until midday. So therefore, the custom is to avoid meat and wine until midday of the 10th of Av, which is Monday, 1:23 p.m. So you can't wake up Monday morning to a corned beef sandwich. And many try, to the best of their ability, also not to take yet a shower for pleasure or laundry until Monday midday. There's a little bit more leniency in case of need when it comes to the latter, when it comes to laundry and when it comes to showering, especially if a person needs a shower. There's more leniency because Shulchan Aruch only makes reference to the fact that we avoid meat and wine until midday of the 10th of Av. So that's a little bit of an introduction or a reminder, and not our main topic here tonight. What we're going to be discussing tonight, how do we rebuild? How do we rebuild? And, we've unfortunately experienced many Tisha B'Avs. And in this era, it is common to get together either through Zoom, or a few years ago when we would come to shul, we would watch videos. And many wonderful organizations are doing a very good job to educate us, to inspire us, to remind us, to assist us in being mindful of what the day is about. So you have videos with lectures about self-improvement, which is magnificent self-improvement. So you have the Chofetz Chaim Heritage Foundation, a wonderful organization that has roots here in Toronto, talking about, if we want to go ahead and rebuild, we have to identify the flaws that brought about the destruction. So let's work on halachos of Lashon Hara. Let's develop or increase our sensitivity towards those things that come out of our mouth. That's wonderful. And I have no doubt that if we would look through flyers over the past few decades of lectures and gatherings and videos and presentations that we've seen over the years, one of them at least would have this title, How Do We Rebuild? In other words, there's something we need to do. And what I would like to share with you is that when you ask that question, we are believers that one day we're going to have that structure again. It's a structure that's going to unite the people of Israel, and it's going to give guidance to humanity. We believe in it. And obviously, if it's important to us, we want to play a role in rebuilding it. So the question is going to be, how do we rebuild? And what I would like to present are two schools. It's always interesting when you have more than one approach, two schools. And the first school is the more traditional school, a very valid approach indeed, where we focus more on things that are spiritual. You want to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. There are some spiritual things that you need to do. Okay? But I would also like to share with you a different approach, perhaps less traditional, perhaps not a school I grew up with, but I'm inspired by them, and I believe that there's what to learn from everyone. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and study some text. We're going to study some text, and we're going to go ahead and achieve that by sharing the screen here. And hopefully it is visible to everyone. Do I get a nod that is it visible, the text here? Excellent. So what we do is, and I would like to thank again our sponsors, the Fishlinsky family. So there are many statements in the Talmud where we are being told, as good Jews, you have to be aware of the fact that you play a role in bringing the redemption, in bringing the Geula, in bringing the redemption. And therefore, throughout the Talmud, I could find all kinds of recommendations made by the rabbis of things we should be doing, things we should be focusing on to bring the Geula. So for example, the Talmud in Sanhedrin is talking about the importance of being osek batorah lishma. The Talmud is focusing on the importance of Torah study and the importance of Torah study for the sake of heaven. Meaning not that I'm studying to go ahead and get more recognition or to get a position, but rather I am studying Torah lishma for the sake of heaven. So as the Talmud lists for us many benefits of a person who is osek, involved in Torah for the sake of heaven, a rabbi by the name of Levi adds that when you study Torah lishma, you are mikarev geula. You bring the redemption. Okay, so I want to go ahead and bring the redemption. I want a better world. There's a lot of suffering in the world. There are many things that are not the way they ought to be. And therefore, I could play a role and I could be a partner in building by studying Torah lishma. So that would be recommendation number one. It's interesting, just on the side, one of the commentators wants to give an insight why specifically the study of Torah for the sake of heaven, for the right reason, is one who brings the redemption. And he presents an explanation based on another Talmudic statement. The Talmud tells us, Kol haomer davar b'shem omro, anyone who shares a statement of Torah and says it in the name of its original source, you know what? Mevi geula la'olam, he brings redemption to the world. So therefore, this commentator notes that you should know, Ele halomdim Torah shelo lishma, those who study Torah but not for the sake of heaven, but rather they want recognition, they want honor, they want to have a good reputation. In general, einam omrim hadvarim b'shem omram. In general, they don't give credit or they don't attribute the statement to the person who originally made it. So therefore, those who study Torah lishma and therefore say things in the name of its original source, they bring the geula. Okay, so this is just a little vort, but what I'm trying to present is the fact that there are spiritual things we need to do if we want to bring the redemption. Spiritual things. For example, and another example comes the Chafetz Chaim, and he tells us that there's another davar shemekarev et geula. There's another thing that brings the geula. Tfilah v'tzaka, prayer and crying out to the Almighty, that too plays a role. Okay, so these are things we are familiar with. And there are many, many such statements that when it comes to tzedakah brings the geula, tshuva brings the geula. Fine, so these are traditional ways of analyzing it. And I would like to argue that the source for this idea that it is more spiritual could be a statement that Rashi shares with us in the name of a midrash. There's a Rashi that tells us the following, that you should know. Mikdash ha'atid, the temple of the future, the one we are waiting for, what we call the third temple. She'anu mitzapin, which we are all waiting for it to be rebuilt, is actually banui u'mishuchlav. It's already built. It's intact. What we are waiting for is that it should be revealed from heaven. This is an approach that Rashi on the surface seems to be telling us, that the building of the structure is not something you should focus on. You want to bring the Geula, you want to base Hamikdash, don't bother by figuring out dimensions or materials or finding a quarry. Don't worry about those things. It will come down from heaven. And therefore, taking this Rashi, we can appreciate the many commentators who tell us, focus on the spiritual. And I think we all agree that it is a day that we should be mindful of the fact that if we become better, we are worthy of more. Focus on the spiritual. Now, to such an extent that I'll quote you something from Reb Chaim Volozhin. We've heard of Reb Chaim Volozhin. He established the Volozhin Yeshiva. We call the Volozhin Yeshiva the mother or the father of the modern day yeshiva. And therefore, in many ways, when you want to talk about a yeshiva philosophy, it could find, right, its roots in teachings of Reb Chaim Volozhin, the great disciple of the Gaon of Vilna. And he tells us something quite incredible that you should know, that Nebuchadnezzar Titus, Nebuchadnezzar and Titus, the two individuals, right, infamous individuals who destroyed the first and the second temple, says Reb Chaim Volozhin, lo asu b'ma'aseim shum pegam v'kilkul klal lemala. Up there in the spiritual realm, they cause no damage. Why? Because due to the fact that we were not on the right spiritual level, that we were a flawed nation. We were a flawed nation. We violated very severe averot in the first temple, and we were lacking the decency of being good towards one another during the second temple. Sinat chinam. Those were the causes. B'chata'enus, he says, nitma'et v'tash. We weakened koach gvura shel mala et mikdash Hashem timu kivyachol hamikdash ha'elyon. What he's saying is that the only way these individuals had the ability to destroy the physical structure in this world was due to the fact that there was damage done already to the spiritual structure, which he calls a mikdash ha'elyon. What kind of damage? Flaws that we need to focus on. These approaches, what Rashi and this Midrash are telling us is, it was a churban due to averot. It will be rebuilt when we fix those flaws, when we focus on those flaws, analyze them, and realize, you know what? We got to do things differently. So when we have those videos and those presentations, and when it is a day that we are mindful of all those things, we are playing a role in rebuilding. All that which we've discussed up until now is very traditional, extremely traditional, and it's true. And there's no question in my mind that the bulk of this period of time and the bulk of Tisha B'Av is to be mindful of the devastation of our history, right? What we've gone through, right? What parents here, your parents, many of you, have gone through. And think about what a tragedy it was, and how they had to live with that burden within them for decades upon decades. And think about the fact that it is all the result of the Jewish people not being where they belong. So how do I get myself back to where I belong? How do I rebuild that structure? Actions. This is what the first approach is all about. But obviously, it's not going to be interesting if we only have the first approach, right? There has to be something else. So what I'm going to start off with is with a statement of the Rambam. And the Rambam, as you all know, Maimonides, in one of his works, he talks and he lists for us all the commandments, mitzvot. And the definition of a mitzvah is something we need to do. There are things we need to do as individuals, and then there are things that we need to do as communities. So when Maimonides, when the Rambam talks about the Bet HaMikdash, he lists the building of the Bet HaMikdash as a mitzvah, ha-mitzvah ha-isrim, mitzvah number 20. We were commanded by the Almighty, livnot bet avodah, a house of worship. What do you do there? So he tells us, hakrava korbanot, in esh tamid, a continuous fire, and also we go there on every holiday, ve'elav ye'alicha, towards that structure, we make our way up, aliyah laregel, bechol shana, every year. Now, by the fact that Maimonides lists this as a mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah that was not just relevant in the past, but it remains a mitzvah, Maimonides clearly does not see the third temple as something that comes from heaven. You cannot list it as a mitzvah if we do not have an obligation to do so. By defining it as something that we should do, a mitzvah, Maimonides, Rambam believes that there is a mitzvah to build a Bet HaMikdash. And also when Maimonides looks at the Mishnah that provides for us the dimensions of the temple, he tells us that we need these dimensions. Do you want to know why the Mishnah provides for us dimensions and details regarding the structure? Because it fits into one of our obligations. This is not a temple that comes down from heaven. If it would be a temple that comes down from heaven, Maimonides would not tell us that the dimensions are there for us as a blueprint. So this clearly indicates that there is such a mitzvah. Now, you could say to me, okay, there is such a mitzvah, but there's a time to perform. There's a time for it. And the designated time would be when the Mashiach comes. So Mashiach, we cannot go ahead and create. We have to wait until he is revealed, until he shows up. So therefore, I appreciate the fact that Maimonides believes that it's a mitzvah, but there's first the coming of the Mashiach that we have to wait for. So to make things a little bit more interesting and complicated, we're going to study a statement in the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud tells us in the name of Rabbi Acha. Now, I'll make it clear, this is not agreed upon on the surface by the Babylonian Talmud. There's different schools, but there is a school that believes Bet HaMikdash atid lehibanot kodem lemalchut Bet David. The temple in Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt before the reestablishment of the kingdom of David, also known as the coming of a Mashiach. And this suddenly, if you put these pieces together, suddenly, when I ask the question, how do we rebuild? Suddenly, perhaps the answer is, very nice to do the spiritual, but there's a physical mitzvah as well. And if we are told that it is to be done before Mashiach comes, why are we not rolling up our sleeves? Why are we not playing a role, right? Why are we not working on the Temple Mount, right? Why are we not pressuring the Israeli government? Why are we not studying more details? Why are we not getting those blueprints out? Many fascinating questions need to be asked. How do we rebuild the temple suddenly become something practical? So you know that what I ask as a theoretical question, others take a little bit more seriously. Now, I'll show you something, does not relate to it directly, but you'll see soon how it comes together. You're able to identify this person on screen here? Sir Moses Montefiore. Okay, Sir Moses Montefiore, a legend in our tradition. A legend because he was a lover of Eretz Yisrael. He visited there, I think, 7 times. And this is before there was first class with El Al, right? He's a person that was concerned about the welfare of Klal Yisrael throughout the world and in Eretz Yisrael. A legend indeed. Just an interesting detail, which before we address the issue that relates to us about Sir Moses Montefiore, I would like to share with you an interesting question that was asked in the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. And the question was, there was a movement to reintern him in Eretz Yisrael. Take the remains of Montefiore from Ramsgate, I think it's called there in England, and take it to Eretz Yisrael. And there was a push. He was a lover of Zion, and it seems to be that some of his descendants had a desire of moving him to Eretz Yisrael. And there was a push perhaps among politicians. And the question was brought in front of rabbinic figures, great rabbinic figures. And the two that we have in writing that address this issue, would it be permissible to transfer the remains of Montefiore and his wife to Eretz Yisrael? One of them was Ramosha Feinstein was asked, and one was Reb Ovadia Yosef. And it's fascinating because there's a very important role we talk about often. Never ask one question to two rabbis. Never do it. Because you're lucky if you only get two answers. Okay, never. It's not a good idea. You ask one rabbi and Shalom Al Yisrael. You could do research beforehand to find out what kind of rabbi we're dealing with, but don't ask two rabbis. So listen to this briefly. In 1978, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked Be'inyan Pinui Atzmot regarding the reinterment of the remains of Rav Moshe Montefiore. So Rav Moshe says that it is so simple that I don't want to even discuss it. It is so simple that Asur lifnot atzmot asar. It's prohibited. And he says, I don't want even discussion in detail because I don't want people to say that the rabbis debated it. Now, why does Rav Moshe Feinstein have an issue when every educated Jew knows that taking remains to Eretz Yisrael is halachically permissible? We all know it. It's in Shulchan Aruch. So comes Rav Moshe and he says the following. Do you know why I have an issue? Because let's analyze the movement. Let's analyze what's behind the push. And he asks, Madua do'agim? Why are they only concerned? Letovat met zeh. Why are they only concerned for the remains of this person? Velo leharbe geonei olam v'tzadikim ukdoshim shebechol hamedinot b'chutz la'aretz. In other words, why is it that so many great rabbinic figures are buried outside of Israel and no one is pushing for it? And suddenly, for Montefiore, they yes, and Rav Moshe says that they are greater than Montefiore and his wife. Okay, so that's why Rav Moshe says you don't go ahead and pick one and remove him to Eretz Yisrael. On the other hand, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says, Mutar lifnot et hamet mekivrosh b'chutz la'aretz. No question. And he says it's a mitzvah na meika. Different approaches. I think you could all understand that perhaps it's a little bit of a different approach to our presence in Eretz Yisrael. Where for Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, a Jew belongs in Israel. For Rav Moshe Feinstein, a Jew belongs in Torah. It happens to be that the Torah provides for you a mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, but it's not priority number one for Rav Moshe. So that's perhaps a discussion, but the reason I mentioned Montefiore is not regarding his burial, but rather there was a big to-do in 1867 where Moses Montefiore visited the Temple Mount. And it appears that some rabbinic figures were unhappy with the fact that he walked on the Temple Mount. In other words, at that time, Jews in general had zero access to the Temple Mount because it was controlled by the Muslims, by the Ottoman Turks. Moses Montefiore had his connections, as you know, and he had access to the Temple Mount, and he visited the Temple Mount. Now, tradition is that he was actually carried in some kind of, they say the way it appears in halachic literature as a box, but I think it was some kind of carriage that he was carried in, where technically he did not walk, and perhaps to minimize the halachic issue that relates to visiting the Temple Mount. But it created a massive debate in Yerushalayim regarding visiting the Temple Mount. While during the Ottoman era, this was only an issue that related to Montefiore. Later on, as Jews had a little bit more access to the Temple Mount, it was a question that was addressed regarding many. And therefore, Rav Kook, for example, made it clear that a Jew does not visit the Temple Mount. As you all know, since 1967, there's been controversy and different movements regarding visiting the Temple Mount. But these visits are not just curiosity. These visits are the byproduct of an attitude that, you know what, rebuilding the temple is more than just the traditional spiritual school. Rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash is more than just self-improvement. It is something practical. We are in a Jewish state. You know how much Rav Goren wanted that there should be a synagogue on the Temple Mount? If it's a Jewish state and God handed you that territory, do the right thing. And do the right thing for some is actually rebuilding. You have a Yerushalmi. There's a place that I visited in Yerushalayim. And again, I may not come from that school, but believe me, I was inspired by that visit. Have you ever been to the Temple Institute, to Machon HaMikdash in Yerushalayim? And let me tell you, when it comes to rebuilding a Beis HaMikdash and all those things that are required, yes, from trumpets to garments to vessels, they are ready to roll. They are simply all ready. They have different sizes for garments for a Kohen. They already practice how to process the Korban Pesach. They have a replica of the Shulchan, of the Aron and the Menorah, all ready to go. This is a philosophy that, number one, obviously takes Maimonides' approach, takes the approach of the Rambam, that rebuilding or that future temple is not as Rashi sees it, as something that comes down from heaven. It is something we're going to do. And it is very possible that part of the drive of this movement is an understanding that there's an opinion in the Jerusalem Talmud that, you know what? It is a mitzvah that already today we have a mitzvah to do because we don't need Mashiach for it. Maybe it will lead to the coming of the Mashiach. In addition, right, Ramban tells us building a Beis HaMikdash is not something that we have to have a king. If the nation itself pushes, it needs to be done. This is a movement that takes a very, very different approach. When I visited that location, I was there 15 years ago. My background is different, right? I did not grow up, I did not get the chinuch and the yeshivas I went through, that this is something we need to focus on. But when I see a group of people that give so much time and effort and energy and commitment for the sake of heaven, to have the structure standing there again and study every single detail to do it, I'm inspired. And maybe in turn it inspires me to go ahead and say, halavai, that my commitment to the school I come from of self-improvement should be as great as their commitment to their school. And together we play a role. And with that, I would like to share with you an insight of a rabbi we've studied a lot in the past, a very special, a tremendous Torah scholar. I think he's the first gadol in Israel that had a university degree, Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, a German rabbi, recognized as a scholar. And he addresses Rashi's opinion regarding the third Beis HaMikdash. Now remember, according to Rashi, it is not something that is going to be built. It's built already in heaven. But rather, it is a structure that's going to be revealed. Asks Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, wait a second. I have a problem with Rashi's approach. Because we all know, and there are many Jewish songs that talk about Meheira Yibone Beis HaMikdash. Very soon in our days, the Talmud tells us, we're going to merit to the Binyan Bet HaMikdash. Binyan Bet HaMikdash. And Rav Yaakov Ettlinger wonders if Rashi is correct, that it is a structure that is in heaven and is just going to come down and be revealed. The language of the Talmud should not be Mehera Yibaneh HaMikdash. The language of the Talmud should be Mehera Yigale Bet HaMikdash. It should be revealed. And he notes that look at all our prayers. All of our prayers are Sheiboneh Beis HaMikdash. And if so, if Rashi is correct, our prayers seem to be incorrect because it should have been Shigale Bet HaMikdash. So therefore he says, Nireh le'aniyut da'ati. It appears to me, devadai, that there's no question. Bet HaMikdash le'atid lavo, the future temple, Yibaneh binyan mamash b'yedei adam. It's going to be constructed as a building by humans. He takes the approach of Rambam and he tells us that even Rashi has to agree with it. So what does Rashi mean that it's going to come down from heaven? So he says that just as there is a body and a soul, so too the Beit HaMikdash has a body and a soul. The body we build, when we are told that there's something ruchani, that there's something spiritual that's gonna come down from heaven, it is the Beit HaMikdash ruchani she'yavo letoch Beit HaMikdash hanivneh, which is gashmi, kinashama betoch haguf. And what he's really telling us is, you know what? It will be rebuilt. But don't expect Beis Hamikdash by only rebuilding the physical. If we are not ready, if we don't address those spiritual issues that brought about the destruction, the structure itself, we could get the greatest architects, we could go ahead and have a construction project, we could perhaps even get permission from the United Nations. It won't be a Beis Hamikdash if we don't have the soul, the Davar Ruchani, the temple that Rashi is talking about and these Midrashim are talking about is the spiritual side. And therefore, there is no question, even if you take the physical school, and even if you are one who is working or studying in the Machon HaMikdash, it's magnificent, there's no question, very inspiring. But without the spiritual, we're going to achieve nothing with the physical structure. We basically need both. And I think that if the flaw of Tisha B'Av, or the flaw that brought about Tisha B'Av with the destruction of the Second Temple, had to do with Sinat Chinam, I think that when we address this issue, how do we rebuild? So yes, there's physical and there's spiritual. The way we're going to rebuild is when there's going to be partnership between the physical and the spiritual. And what I mean by that is to build Eretz Yisrael, to build Yerushalayim and to build the temple, you need physical. You need people who rolled up sleeves and removed boulders. When we read about people who worked and they dried the swamps and they built Eretz Yisrael. These are people that are building the land, people who built Yerushalayim. These are people that are building the physical. And yes, one day there are going to be physical people who are going to build the Beis HaMikdash. We have to respect them, right? We have to appreciate them. We have to realize that they are achieving a tremendous amount of good. But we need the spiritual. The spiritual is basically those who study Torah, who are inspired by Torah, who become personalities of Torah. What's a personality of Torah? Ahavas Chesed, a person that pursues peace, a person who is sensitive towards others, a person who values tradition but values his people, a person who values the land of Israel, and could go ahead and come together with those who are building the physical and say, you know what? We are partners. We're going to play the role spiritually while we appreciate your physical one. And by the way, when that happens, those who are doing the physical will appreciate the spiritual. When you come together and all parties appreciate one another, that's when we're going to be worthy for the structure and hopefully for the coming of a Mashiach and the bringing of the Geula. And that's really the focus of the day. Appreciating the different schools. There are different schools. Communities are diverse. The land of Israel is diverse. When there's an appreciation for all parties and an understanding that we're all one big family and we can get along with one another, I think that's an important tool, or perhaps the most important tool in the process. So we learned a little bit about Tisha B'Av. We reviewed a few of the halachos. We talked a little bit about what we should be mindful during the day itself. It's a time to reflect, a time to remember of how much things are not the way they should be, they ought to be. And even in the world, we're still in this perhaps better state that we were months ago, but we still feel this level of insecurity, right? These variants, there are things that are still unsettling. And deep down, we believe that when God created this magnificent world, he wanted a settled world. This is not the ideal world, but a settled world is a successful world when it has spiritual guidance. And the source for that guidance to humanity is that structure. So that structure is important to us. And our history is a history of things not being the way they should be. Every kina and every historical event we're going to study, we're going to think of the fact that all of this is the byproduct of a Tisha B'Av, and therefore we commemorate all these tragic events on Tisha B'Av. Things are not the way they should be. How do we fix it? How do we fix it? Yes, we're going to take the approach, the traditional approach of self-improvement, of respecting one another, seeing the good, understanding that being a Jew is not just being exactly the way you were educated. Think a little bit broader. And hopefully with this Ahavas Yisrael, we can uproot the hatred, fix the flaw, and merit indeed a rebuilding. So that's a little bit some thoughts I have regarding Tisha B'Av. My blessing to everyone is that we should merit not to have a Tisha B'Av, but if we do have it, it should be a meaningful one where we focus. It should be easy for those who are fasting. And please remember that health is priority number one. So ask questions when it comes to any medication or situations that a person is required not to fast. But the main thing is to do our part in making ourselves better, communities better, and hopefully Klal Yisrael better. Thank you again to our sponsors. Neshama Amanya should have an aliyah. And thank you everyone for joining us here tonight for our Limud Torah. Thank you.